Elise Thornton knew the dress was ruined the moment her sisters smiled. Not politely, not kindly, but the way someone smiles when they've already won a game the other person doesn't even know they're playing. Gwen held the black dress up like she was presenting a family heirloom, while Margot pressed a hand to her mouth, her sharp eyes gleaming with something that looked nothing like joy. "This was Mom's," Gwen said, her voice so sweet it made Elise's teeth ache. "She'd want you to wear it tonight, to the Voss Holdings gala." For one foolish second, hope rose in Elise's chest. The Ashton Voss Charity Gala, the biggest winter event in Chicago, where every family in high society dreamed of walking through those doors, of being seen, acknowledged, chosen, and Elise hadn't expected to go at all. "You really mean it?" she asked softly, her gray-blue eyes blinking fast as if trying to hold something fragile from breaking. Margot tilted her head, her auburn hair brushing her shoulder under the light. "Of course, it's not like anyone's going to look at you anyway, so the dress doesn't really matter." But then Elise picked up the dress, and her fingers touched the truth. The black silk that once belonged to her mother, the last dress she'd worn before the illness took her, had faded so thin that light passed through it. The stitching along the left hip had been cut and resewn with thread as thin as cobweb, the kind that'd snap with a single sharp movement. The zipper down the back had been swapped for a cheap one, the kind that'd pop open if she breathed a little too deep. And that was the perfect trap, because this was their mother's dress, and refusing it meant disrespecting her memory. Elise's face went cold. Gwen watched her realize it, and her smile didn't change at all. This wasn't a gift. It was a sentence, wrapped in silk and memory. Her sisters wanted her to walk into a room full of tailored suits and diamond gowns, wanted her to stand among Chicago's elite in a dress about to fall apart, and wanted the humiliation to happen in front of the most powerful man in the room. But what Gwen and Margot didn't know was that man, Ashton Voss, the boss of all bosses, would notice Elise before he noticed anyone else. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button so I can keep telling it. Share this with someone who needs to hear that broken things aren't worthless. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. The Thornton house had once known laughter. Elise remembered that dimly, the way one remembers the scent of perfume lingering on the collar of someone long gone. Her mother, Helen Thornton, sitting by the window of the sewing room on October afternoons, Chicago sunlight slanting through the white curtains and falling over her hands that were always holding a needle, always creating something more beautiful than the material she had started with. She taught Elise how to hold a needle before she taught her how to hold a pen, taught her how to tell cotton from linen by closing her eyes and touching the cloth, taught her that a good stitch wasn't the straightest one, but the one that knew when it needed to curve. "You have hands that know how to listen," her mother said, and Elise didn't understand that sentence until many years later, when her hands still knew how to sew even after her mind had forgotten how to hope. Helen died in the winter when Elise was 19. Not suddenly. She had been sick for a long time, her body fading the way fabric does after being washed too many times, the threads growing thinner until light could pass through. Elise was the one who sat beside her bed through those final months, not because Gwen or Margot didn't love their mother, but because they loved her in a different way, the way of people who are too afraid to look at the ending, and so they choose to turn away first. Elise stayed. She always stayed, and that was exactly the thing her two sisters never forgave her for. Not because Elise had done anything wrong, but because their mother called Elise's name last, her thin, bony hand closing around Elise's fingers instead of theirs. And there are some things people cannot forget even after the dead have been lowered into the ground. After Helen died, the house didn't collapse all at once. It decayed slowly. Richard Thornton, her father, had once run a construction company large enough to keep the family comfortable, but not large enough to survive a lawsuit that dragged on for 3 years with a former business partner. The company went bankrupt, the house was mortgaged, and Richard withdrew into his study like an animal retreating into its den, sitting there among unpaid bills and collection letters, not drinking, not shouting, not pounding the desk, only silent, and his silence hurt more than any shout, because at least when someone shouts, they still admit that the person listening exists. Richard looked through Elise as if she were a piece of furniture in the house that he couldn't afford to repair and didn't have the heart to throw away. Gwen was the first to understand that the ship was sinking and to start looking for a lifeboat. Every morning, she sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee and the guest list for social events, reading each name as though she were reading a restaurant menu, choosing men by net worth, crossing them off by rumored debt, circling the ones who had recently been widowed or had just inherited money. Margot sat beside her, offering comments in a voice as sharp as shears cutting cloth. Mr. Morrison is too old. Mr. Whitfield is bald. But he has 3 penthouses. And the two of them laughed together, with the laughter of people calculating survival and calling it ambition. The Voss Holdings charity gala was the height of the winter season, the doorway into the truly upper world, where money wasn't counted in millions but in influence. And Ashton Voss was the name Gwen had circled most heavily on her list, so heavily that the ink had bled through the paper. Both sisters needed to shine tonight, and in order to shine, they needed darkness standing beside them. Elise was that darkness. She had always been that darkness. Only this time, her sisters had made sure that the darkness would tear open in front of everyone. That morning, while Gwen and Margot fought over the large mirror in the master bedroom, Elise sat in the laundry room in the basement, where light only slipped in through a small window near the ceiling, and the smell of detergent mixed with the damp scent of things that had been forgotten for too long. The black dress lay across her lap, and Elise no longer looked at the damaged places, because she had memorized every wound on it since the night before. Instead, she closed her eyes and pressed her face into the collar, near the seam where her mother's neck had once touched, and breathed in deeply. Nothing remained. The jasmine perfume Helen used to spray every evening before going down to the living room had faded long ago, maybe from the last wash before she was admitted to the hospital, or maybe even before that, when the illness had begun taking away small things no one noticed in time. The perfume disappearing before the woman who wore it disappeared, and now the dress only smelled of old fabric, of time, of something that had once belonged to someone who loved her, but was no longer here to prove it. Elise opened her eyes. Her hand was still resting on the fabric, and she realized she was smoothing it by habit, the way her mother used to smooth her hair every night before bed, gently, again and again, as if tenderness could be taught to the fingers if repeated often enough. She set the dress aside and pulled open the bottom drawer of the old metal cabinet used for holding bleach bottles, the place where she hid her sketchbook. It was a brown-covered notebook, its corners curled, its spine loosened from being opened too many times on nights when she couldn't sleep. Inside were the dress designs Elise had drawn in pencil at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when the whole house was asleep and she could dream without fear of anyone seeing. Dresses with sleeves curving like opening petals, long-skirted gowns with diagonal cuts she had calculated with both instinct and the knowledge from 2 unfinished years at design school, before the tuition money disappeared along with her father's company. The last page held the dress she had drawn over and over the most. Not the most splendid one, not the most complicated one. It was simple, black, with a boat neckline, a fitted waist, and a hem that touched the floor without dragging. A dress made for a woman who walked into a room without needing anyone's permission, without needing anyone to turn and look, but they would turn and look because she wasn't trying. Elise touched the faded pencil line on the page, and felt the distance between the notebook and reality stretch as wide as the ocean. The sound of the door being pushed open dragged her back. Gwen stood in the laundry room doorway, her blonde hair already curled perfectly, the ruby-red dress hanging from a hook in her right hand, her eyes sliding from the black dress on Elise's lap to the open sketchbook. Elise closed the notebook, but one beat too late. "Drawing again," Gwen said, her voice not asking, but deciding. Such clever hands. Too bad no one marries a pair of hands. She turned away without waiting for Elise to answer, but Margot was already standing behind her, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe, her narrowed eyes looking down at Elise with the kind of pity people give a wounded animal on the side of the road when they have no intention of stopping to help. No matter how you fix it, that dress won't save you. Then they both walked away, the sound of their heels fading across the wooden floor like a countdown. And Elise sat alone in the laundry room with her mother's dress on her lap and the notebook of her dreams in her hands, wondering why she still kept both, when both reminded her of things she didn't have, a mother who was gone, and a future that would never come. But she kept them anyway. She always kept the things other people threw away. That was her problem. Or maybe it was the only thing she had left. A 20-minute drive away, on the top floor of the Peninsula Hotel, a man stood by the glass wall looking down at the lobby below without feeling the slightest pleasure. Ashton Voss was 33 years old, with neatly cut black hair, a square jaw, eyes so dark brown that in low light they looked almost black, and the way he stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, his back straight but not stiff, was like the way a large animal watched over its territory. without needing to growl for everything around it to know it should keep its distance. Below, the staff were setting up the stage, spreading white tablecloths, adjusting each flower in the crystal vases, and every movement they made served one purpose: to make tonight look like generosity, when in truth it was power, wearing a suit and smiling. Jerome Kessler stood behind him, 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair, and the solid build of a man who had lived long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent, holding a guest list as thick as a novel, without needing to open it, because he already knew every name inside. "You have to dance tonight," Jerome said, his voice as calm as if he were reporting the weather. "At least one dance." Ashton didn't turn around. "I'd rather negotiate with the FBI. "The FBI is easier," Jerome replied. "At least they say outright what they want." One corner of Ashton's mouth lifted slightly. Not enough to call it a smile, but enough for Jerome to know he was listening. That was how Ashton Voss communicated with the world, through signals so small most people missed them, and missing them was often the last mistake they made in any relationship with him. He wasn't the kind of man who grew angry loudly. He was the kind who silently remembered, and his memory was the thing that kept people awake at night. He knew the name of every server working tonight, knew which of them was struggling financially, knew who had just had a baby, and he remembered exactly which guest had lied to him at last year's gala, the man who had said, "It's a pleasure doing business with you," then 3 weeks later signed with a competitor. Ashton had said nothing then, had only smiled and raised his glass, and 6 months later that man lost that contract along with 2 others he never understood why he had lost. Jerome turned a page in the list, though he didn't need to look. "The Thornton family will be coming. 3 daughters. The father is buried in debt." Ashton didn't react. The name Thornton meant nothing to him at that moment. It would mean something before the night was over, but he didn't know that yet. "And as for women," Jerome added, his voice faintly dry, "there will be about 40 trying to dance with you, 20 trying to sit beside you at dinner, and at least 10 who have practiced in front of a mirror how to drop a handkerchief so you'll pick it up. And none of them will ask me what I'm thinking," Ashton said. Jerome was silent for a beat. It was the kind of silence he reserved for the rare moments when Ashton revealed something behind the armor. Not much, just a thin crack, but enough for someone who knew how to look, to see that inside this man was an emptiness that money and power couldn't fill. Ashton had lost his parents when he was very young, and ever since then, everyone who came close to him had carried a list with them. Money, contracts, influence, marriage, security, but very few came empty-handed and simply wanted to know the truth. "Wear the dark blue suit," Jerome said, pulling him back to reality. "And try not to frighten the whole city." Ashton turned away from the window, and as he walked past Jerome, the older man watched him with the eyes of someone who had cared for an orphaned child since he was 14 years old, and was now watching that child prepare to step into a room full of people who wanted something from him, and he wondered whether anyone in that room would give him something instead of taking something away. The Thornton family car stopped in front of the Peninsula Hotel gates at 7 o'clock in the evening, and Richard was the first to step out. His gray suit, once perfectly fitted, now slightly loose at the shoulders because he had lost so much weight over the past year. Though he still held his head high out of the habit of a man who had once had money, the kind of posture the body remembers even after pride has forgotten. Gwen stepped out after her father, and she knew exactly what she was doing with every step. Her ruby-red dress fitted tight through the bodice before flaring lightly from the knees. Her blonde hair swept high to reveal a long neck wearing a necklace Elise knew was borrowed but looked like an heirloom. And Gwen smiled at the doorman with the smile she had practiced in front of the mirror since 3 o'clock that afternoon. Margot followed in a champagne gold dress, less dazzling than her sister's but bright enough to draw the eye, her reddish-brown hair falling over one shoulder, and the way the 2 sisters stood together beneath the hotel canopy looked like a carefully arranged painting. 2 brilliant flowers waiting to be placed in the finest vase in the room. Then Elise stepped out. She stepped out last because no one waited for her. No one held the car door for her. And when her old high heels touched the red carpet, she felt the thin fabric of the black dress tighten around her body, as if reminding her that it could betray her at any moment. Inside the lobby, the crystal lights turned everything into a brighter, prettier, more false version of itself. And her mother's dress, the dress that had looked merely old in the laundry room light, now looked shabby beneath thousands of crystal drops hanging from the ceiling like an apology no one wanted to hear. Its frayed fabric glaring beside satin and silk, its black faded into something that no longer had a name, and Elise felt every gaze in the room slide over her and then stop. Not stopping out of admiration, but out of confusion. The kind of confusion people feel when they see something that doesn't belong where it is standing. The whispers began on the left and drifted toward the right like wind moving over water. Who is she? The youngest Thornton daughter. Good heavens, that dress. A woman covered her mouth with a fan, not out of politeness, but because she wanted the person beside her to lean closer and hear better. Elise kept both hands along the sides of her skirt, her fingers pressing lightly against her left hip, where she knew the weakest seam was, and she tried to breathe with only half her lungs, because breathing any deeper would be a risk. Her father had disappeared into the crowd of men near the bar, so quickly that it seemed the distance between him and his daughters was the first thing he needed tonight. Gwen placed a hand on Elise's elbow and led her through the ballroom. Not toward the dance floor, not toward the stage, not toward any of the laughing groups, but to a corner near the passage leading to the restrooms, where people would pass by and see her most clearly, where the lighting was still bright enough to reveal every frayed thread, but hidden enough that no one had to admit they had looked. "Stand here," Gwen said, her voice gentle, as if she were arranging a vase of flowers in its proper place. "You can watch everyone." Margot tilted her head, her eyes traveling from Elise's feet to her shoulders, before stopping on her face with a smile as thin as paper. "You surely don't think anyone is going to ask you to dance, do you?" Elise didn't answer. She stood in that corner and looked out at the ballroom, where hundreds of people were laughing and raising glasses and pretending to care for one another, and she felt like the dress she was wearing, something that had once belonged to someone loved, but now remained only as proof that time takes everything, without asking permission first. Somewhere above, in a penthouse suite Elise didn't even know existed, a man was buttoning his midnight blue suit and preparing to descend the stairs into a room full of people who wanted something from him, and he also didn't know that in the darkest corner of the ballroom tonight, there was a girl trying to disappear, and she would be the only person he saw. Elise had been standing in the corner of the room for 15 minutes when she heard laughter. Not the happy kind, but the kind with teeth, the kind people used when they wanted someone to know they were being laughed at right to their face. A few steps away from her, a group of 4 middle-aged women in expensive evening gowns had gathered around a young woman, probably only in her early 20s, with long black hair, wide eyes, and one hand gripping a glass of wine as if it were a life raft in the middle of the sea. The girl had just tried to introduce herself and stumbled halfway through the sentence, the sound catching in her throat, her face flushing red, and she tried to start over. But the harder she tried, the more the words refused to come out, knocking into one another inside her mouth, like objects tumbling down a staircase. One woman in the group imitated her, repeating the girl's broken sound with falsely innocent eyes, and the whole group laughed, hiding the laughter behind their hands, though no one was truly trying to hide it. The girl shrank into herself, shoulders drawing inward, eyes reddening, and Elise recognized that expression because she had seen it on her own face in the mirror every time Gwen said something that cut directly into the deepest bruise, the expression of someone trying not to cry in front of people who would be happier if they saw her cry. Elise didn't think. She stepped beside the girl, naturally, as if they had known each other for a long time, and said, "Excuse me, I wanted to ask about your bracelet. Where did you get it? It's beautiful." The girl blinked, looking down at her own wrist as if she had forgotten she was wearing a bracelet. Elise smiled and tilted her head toward the east balcony. "Could you show me the way to the balcony? It's my first time here, and this place is so large I've gotten lost." The girl nodded, and Elise gently placed a hand on her elbow, leading her away from the group of women without looking back, without confronting them, without lecturing them, without saying a single sentence for them to hear, only quietly pulling the girl out of the circle like drawing a thread from tangled fabric without breaking any more strands. On the balcony, the girl whispered "thank you" in a voice that was still trembling, and Elise said, "It's nothing. I truly do like the bracelet," then stood beside her in silence until her shoulders lowered and her breathing returned to normal. Elise went back into the ballroom just as the music stopped in the middle of the piece. The violin that had been playing suddenly fell silent, followed by a small, dry sound like a rubber band snapping, and the old musician sitting in the front row looked down at his instrument with the face of a man who had just been betrayed by the most familiar thing he owned. A string had broken. The whole orchestra faltered, several players looking at one another, the conductor turning aside, and the guests began to murmur because the interruption reminded them that behind perfect music were human beings who could make mistakes. Elise looked at the old musician, then looked into the small crossbody purse she had brought that night. The old purse Gwen had once told her to throw away because it looks like a sewing kit. And Gwen was right. It was a sewing kit. Inside were always a spool of nylon thread, several needles, small scissors, the things Elise carried the way other women carried lipstick, because her hands didn't know how to live without them. She went to the old musician, sat down, took out the thin nylon thread, and with hands that knew the work, temporarily tied the broken string tightly enough for him to finish the song. The old musician looked at her, his eyes narrowing with surprise. "Are you an instrument repairer?" Elise finished the last knot, checked the tension with a light pluck, then smiled. "No, I'm just used to fixing things that break." On the balcony above, Ashton Voss was leaning against the railing, a glass of wine in his hand untouched, and he had seen everything. The girl in the ruined dress leading a stranger away from a cruel crowd, then sitting down to tie a string for an old musician without waiting for anyone to ask. Jerome stood beside him, following the direction of Ashton's gaze. "Who are you looking at?" Ashton didn't answer right away. He set the wineglass down on the railing. "The only girl in this room who isn't trying to make me look." Below, Gwen had seen Elise sitting beside the musician, and her face tightened with irritation, not because her younger sister had done anything wrong, but because her younger sister was being seen, and that had not been part of the plan. "You're making friends with strangers again," Gwen said when Elise returned to the corner. Margot tilted her head, a mocking gaze flashing in her eyes. "At least you know how to serve people. It suits you." Elise didn't answer. She stood back in her old place, both hands pressing lightly against the left hip of her dress, unaware that upstairs, a man had just decided she was the most interesting thing in this room full of diamonds. It happened faster than Elise could prepare for. She had returned to the corner of the room less than 5 minutes earlier when Gwen appeared beside her, one hand closing around her elbow with just enough pressure to look affectionate from the outside, but tight enough for Elise to know this wasn't an invitation. "The organizers are taking commemorative photos with the VIP guests on the stage," Gwen said, her smile so wide her cheekbones almost trembled. "You need to be there. It's a family photo." Elise looked at her sister. Since when had Gwen wanted her in a family photo? Since when had she been allowed to stand beside her two sisters under the lights, instead of behind them in the dark? The answer should have been obvious, but at that moment, there was still one small part inside Elise's chest that refused to die. The part that hoped maybe tonight would be different. Maybe Gwen truly wanted her beside them. Maybe the dress would hold until the night was over. And it was that foolish little piece of hope that made her nod. The small stage stood on the east side of the lobby, its wooden floor polished smooth, the backdrop a white cloth printed with the Voss Holdings logo, and the photography lights had already been turned on, not the gentle candlelight of the ballroom, but cold, sharp, blue-white flash, the kind of light that forgave no flaw. Gwen stepped up first, standing in the center, shoulders straight, chin slightly lifted. Perfect. Margot stood on the right, tilting her head just enough for her reddish-brown hair to fall over her shoulder, and Elise stood on the left, feeling the lights pour over the black dress like boiling water over thin paper. Every frayed place, showing 10 times more clearly, every patch becoming painfully visible, and she saw her own reflection in the camera lens, a small figure between 2 streaks of red and gold, like an ink stain on a painting someone had forgotten to erase. The photographer said, "Turn slightly to the right," and Elise turned, and at that exact moment, Margot's foot stepped onto the hem of her dress. Elise wasn't sure whether it was deliberate or an accident, but she knew, she always knew, only she still chose to hope she was wrong. The fabric pulled, a small force, but enough. The cheap zipper down her back couldn't take it. It burst open with a small, dry, quick sound, like fingers snapping a matchstick. And the back of the dress opened, the lining exposed beneath the flash, not revealing skin, nothing indecent, but clear and cruel, as if the last layer protecting her had been peeled away before the eyes of 100 people holding wine glasses, and now holding their breath. The camera still clicked. The photographer was a beat too slow before lowering the lens. But below the stage, a society reporter had been quicker. Phone raised, finger tapping twice, and the moment was captured before Elise could even reach behind her. She tried to grab the fabric, but couldn't reach it, her fingers touching the empty air where cloth should have been. And she froze. Not from cold, but from the sensation of knowing she was being watched and could do nothing to stop it. An uncomfortable stillness, heavy as lead, gripped the room. Then came laughter. One small laugh behind a fan, followed by whispers, then another laugh, and Elise heard it all more clearly than the music because humiliation has its own frequency. It made her ears catch every cruel sound within 30 feet like radar. Gwen inhaled, her eyes widening with perfect surprise. The kind of surprise someone must practice in front of a mirror at least 10 times to make it look that natural. "Elise, your dress." Margot rushed toward her, both hands reaching out as if to cover her, but her eyes were bright, the brightness of someone seeing exactly what she had been waiting for. And in that moment, standing on the stage beneath the cold blue-white lights, her hand still reaching behind her back, struggling to hold the torn edges together, the thing that hurt Elise most wasn't the torn dress, wasn't the laughter, wasn't the pitying eyes of 100 strangers, but the fact that she had known from the beginning. She had known from the moment her 2 sisters smiled in the bedroom that morning, and she had still hoped she was wrong, and she had been wrong to hope. Elise stepped down from the stage, turned toward the emergency exit, both hands clenched behind her back to hold the fabric that had betrayed her. And she was going to leave. She was going to get out of here. She would walk home if she had to, because anything would be better than standing here 1 second longer. But Margot caught her wrist, her fingers tightening just enough. "Don't run," she whispered. "It makes you look guilty." Elise jerked her hand free, her voice trembling but not breaking. "Guilty of what?" Gwen leaned close to her ear, so close Elise could smell the expensive perfume on her sister's neck, the kind of scent her mother never wore because she said expensive perfume was the way people wore a mask and called it style. "Guilty of forgetting who you are," Gwen whispered, and the last 2 words fell into Elise's ear heavier than any laughter in the ballroom that night. Elise hurried through the lobby with both hands clenched behind her back, her fingers gripping the edge of the fabric as if it were the last piece of dignity she had left, and she didn't look at anyone, didn't look to the left where Gwen stood with a face that had shifted from pretending to be surprised to being truly pleased, didn't look to the right where a group of women were whispering loudly enough for her to hear the words "pathetic" and "poor thing" mixed in with the sound of champagne glasses touching. She only looked straight at the green exit sign at the end of the east hallway, and walked toward it like a drowning person swimming toward the only light still visible. At the same time, Ashton Voss was standing among 3 businessmen near the bar. He had left the balcony almost 20 minutes earlier and was listening to a silver-haired man explain a new real estate project on the south side of the city when silence cut across the ballroom. Not a silence that came gradually, but the kind that dropped all at once, as if someone had switched off the sound. Ashton knew that kind of silence. It was the kind that happened when something had just broken in front of a crowd, and everyone was deciding whether to laugh or pretend they hadn't seen it. He turned, looked toward the stage, and saw her, the girl who had tied the string for the old musician, the girl who had led a stranger away from a cruel crowd, now backing away from the stage with both hands held behind her, and her face white beneath the camera flashes. And he didn't need anyone to explain what had happened, because the way she walked said everything. Not the walk of someone who was angry or looking for attention, but the walk of someone trying to leave a place before that place took the last thing she still had. Ashton set his wine glass on the nearest table without looking, said "excuse me" to the silver-haired man, in a voice that wasn't truly apologizing, and moved fast, not running because Ashton Voss never ran, but every step was longer than usual. He left the ballroom through the VIP side staircase he knew well, because this was his event, and he knew every passage in this building, the way he knew the veins on the back of his own hand. Went down 1 floor, turned right, passed through the backstage preparation room, and appeared in the east hallway by the emergency exit before Elise could touch the push bar. She stopped. He stood there in the empty hallway, the fluorescent light above falling over his face in a way completely different from the crystal glow in the ballroom. Here, he looked less like a kingpin and more like an ordinary man, but his dark brown eyes hadn't changed. They looked at her and didn't look away. He said nothing. He took off his dark blue suit jacket, the jacket Jerome had chosen for him 2 hours earlier, worth more than everything Elise owned put together, and handed it to her. He didn't drape it over her shoulders. He didn't touch her. He only held it out with one hand, then turned his back. He stood between her and the long glass wall where the guests inside the ballroom could see into the hallway, his broad back shielding Elise from every gaze. And he stood there in silence, giving her time to put on the jacket without anyone seeing anything more than she wanted them to see. Elise stood behind him, her hands trembling as she pulled the suit jacket over her shoulders, the fabric warm because it had just left his body, and she caught the faint scent of cologne on the collar, something like wood and leather, and she hated herself, because even in the most humiliating moment of her life, she still noticed things like the scent of cologne on a stranger's suit jacket. When she had adjusted it, he turned back around. "Were you going to leave?" he asked, his voice neither loud nor soft, just enough for the two of them to hear. "I should leave," Elise said, and she was surprised that her voice didn't break. "Who said that?" "Everyone in that room." Ashton looked at her, and something shifted in those almost black eyes. Not pity, because pity looked down, and he was looking straight at her. "I'm not in that room," he said. "I'm here." Elise didn't know how to answer, because no one had ever said anything like that to her in a voice like that, with eyes like that, in a fluorescent hallway behind the emergency exit of the most luxurious hotel in Chicago, while she was wearing her mother's torn dress and the borrowed jacket of the most powerful kingpin in the city. He didn't ask her to dance. He said, "Come back with me, not to dance. Just so they know you leave when you want, not when they want." Elise looked at him, and she understood that this wasn't a romantic invitation, not a knight saving a princess, not a scene from one of the movies she used to watch at midnight when she couldn't sleep. It was the offer of an ally, from a man whose full name she didn't yet know, but she knew that when he stood with his back turned to cover her, no one dared look past him, and maybe that was what she needed right now, more than any comfort, not tenderness, but a wall. She nodded, and they returned to the ballroom together. Ashton half a step ahead, Elise behind him in a suit jacket twice the size of her body. And when the door opened and the crystal light poured over them, the ballroom went silent for the second time that night, but this time the silence had a different shape. It wasn't the silence before laughter, but the silence before a question no one dared ask out loud. Ashton led Elise back into the ballroom, but he didn't lead her to the dance floor, didn't lead her to the VIP table, didn't lead her anywhere the crowd's eyes were gathered. He simply stood beside her in the area near the stage, where the organizers were preparing for the charity speech, and he stood there with both hands in his pockets, not touching her, not saying anything to her, only being present, and Ashton Voss's presence within 3 feet had its own weight. It changed the way the air moved around him. It made people who were about to step closer change direction. It made mouths that were opening to whisper close again, not because he threatened anyone, but because people instinctively knew that speaking badly of someone while Ashton Voss was standing beside her was a decision they couldn't afford to pay for. Gwen and Margot stood stiffly on the other side of the room near the bar, and Elise could feel their eyes cutting through the crowd toward her. Not angry eyes, but confused ones. The kind of confusion that comes when someone has set a trap successfully, only for the prey to suddenly be guarded by a wolf, and they don't know what to do next, because there is no script for this situation. The charity speech lasted 15 minutes. Someone talked about schools, someone talked about hospitals, someone thanked Voss Holdings for its generosity, and Elise heard none of it because she was busy answering a question inside her own mind, the question of whether she was here because he had kept her here or because she had chosen to stay. And she realized he hadn't kept her at all. He hadn't said a single word since they came back into the ballroom. He had only stood there and given her the right to decide. And the right to decide was a luxury she didn't often receive from anyone in her family. The speech ended. Applause broke out. The orchestra began playing again, and Elise still stood there. She didn't move toward the emergency exit. She didn't look for her father. She didn't look for her 2 sisters. She stayed, and that was her choice. Ashton looked at her, and perhaps he had been waiting for that exact moment, because the question he asked sounded like the question of a man who already knew the answer, but still wanted to hear her say it. "Would you like to dance now?" Elise looked at him, and instead of saying yes or no, she asked in return, "Are you asking because I look less pathetic now?" Ashton didn't smile, but his eyes warmed by 1 degree, something only a person standing close enough could see. "I'm asking because now you're choosing to be here, not enduring being here." Elise didn't answer with words. She placed her hand in the one he offered, and they stepped onto the dance floor, and the ballroom fell silent again, but this time Elise wasn't afraid of the silence because she hadn't come here alone. On the dance floor, Ashton led her with the precision of a man who knew how to dance, but didn't wish to show off. Each step enough to hold the rhythm, but never wide enough to pull attention, and he spoke softly enough for only her to hear. "Do you know who I am?" "Everyone knows who you are, Mr. Voss. I'm not asking what they know." he said. I'm asking what you know. Elise was silent for one beat, and in that beat of silence, she heard the true weight of the question. It wasn't small talk. It was the kind of question people only asked when the answer truly mattered to them. I know enough to understand that dancing with you might be more dangerous than a torn dress. One corner of Ashton's mouth lifted. Then why are you still here? Because you gave me a choice, Elise said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. Not many people do that. Silence fell between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that comes when two people are weighing whether they should trust each other, and neither has decided yet, but neither is leaving either. What do you do? He asked. I'm a seamstress, Ashton repeated. A seamstress. And the way he said those two words held no contempt, no surprise, only weight, as if he were picking them up and turning them in his hand to see them from every angle. Are you surprised? Elise asked. No, he said. I was only thinking that people who sew for others often forget to sew for themselves. And that sentence struck Elise harder than any compliment could have, because it wasn't a compliment. It was the truth. The kind of truth she had hidden in the bottom drawer, along with her sketchbook and her midnight dreams. The kind of truth no one saw, because no one ever looked long enough. For the first time that night, Elise laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not a defensive laugh, but a real one. The kind that began at the corners of her eyes before spreading to her mouth, and Ashton looked at that smile as if he had just found something he had searched for across so many rooms full of diamonds, only to discover it here, on the face of a seamstress in a torn dress and a borrowed jacket twice the size of her body. The next morning, Elise hadn't even opened her eyes before she heard Gwen's footsteps on the stairs, faster than usual, the footsteps of someone carrying news and unable to wait to throw it in someone's face. Gwen pushed open Elise's bedroom door without knocking, which wasn't new, but the smile on her face was new. It wasn't the satisfied smile from last night, when the dress had torn on stage. It was wider, more dangerous, the kind of smile worn by someone who had just found a new weapon. She placed the iPad on the table beside Elise's bed. The screen opened to a society blog the Chicago elite read every morning as if reading scripture, and the headline stretched across the page in bold type. Something about the mysterious girl in the torn dress, and Ashton Voss standing beside her all night, and shocking details from the Peninsula Charity Gala. And Elise didn't need to read the whole article, because she had already seen the photograph the society reporter had taken on the stage, the instant the zipper burst open, her hand reaching behind her back and grasping nothing, and the second photograph, Elise standing beside Ashton in the ballroom, the dark blue suit jacket hanging loose on her body like a giant's coat draped over a child, and the way those two pictures were placed side by side created a story Elise had never written, but now had to live with. Congratulations, Gwen said, her voice so sweet it made Elise feel sick. You're famous now. Margot appeared behind her sister, a cup of coffee in her hand, her reddish-brown eyes sliding over the screen before stopping on Elise's face with a thin smile. They wrote theatrical. That's kind. I would have written desperate. Elise said nothing. She folded the iPad face down as if closing a door, while knowing that behind that door, the whole city was reading. Her father entered the dining room 10 minutes later, his face grayer than usual, and his face was already gray on an ordinary day, because that was the default color of a man who had lost everything and was still pretending he hadn't. He didn't look at Elise. He sat down, placed his phone on the table, and said to no one in particular, though everyone knew exactly who he was speaking to. Harrison pulled out. The room went cold. Harrison was the potential business partner Richard had spent 3 months cultivating. Taking him to dinner twice, sending proposals 3 times, and almost convincing him to invest in a small project that would be enough to keep the family from sinking any deeper. He said the Thorntons are mixed up with Voss, Richard continued, his voice flat as a tabletop. Too dangerous. Gwen looked at Elise. Margot looked at Elise. Richard didn't look at Elise, and the fact that he didn't look hurt more than the way her 2 sisters did, because at least when someone looked at her, she still existed. But when she was ignored, she became only an empty space, where everyone could pour blame. No one asked whether she was hurt. No one asked how she had felt last night, standing on that stage in a torn dress in front of 100 people. No one said she was innocent. Her family's silence that morning was heavier than any accusation, because at least an accusation would have given her a chance to defend herself, while silence closed the trial before the defendant could open her mouth. A 20-minute drive away, In the study on the penthouse floor that Ashton used as his private office, Jerome Kessler placed an iPad on the desk with far more composure than Gwen, though the news was much the same. "The society blogs are running the story," Jerome said. "2 major pages have already posted it. Some people are saying she staged it, that the dress tore on purpose to get your attention." Ashton stood by the window, his back to Jerome, looking down at the morning streets of Chicago, where people were living their ordinary lives without needing to know who had danced with whom the night before. "Do you believe that?" he asked without turning around. Jerome didn't need to think. A person staging something doesn't try to leave before you come close. Ashton was silent. On his desk, beside the untouched cup of black coffee, lay the dark blue suit jacket Elise had returned. It had been folded so neatly that Ashton knew the person who had folded it had taken more time than necessary. Every crease exact, every line straight, the folding of someone used to working with fabric and respecting every thread. And tucked inside the breast pocket was a small piece of paper torn from some notebook, the handwriting leaning slightly to the right, careful but a little unsteady on the last 2 words. "Thank you. I'm sorry for the trouble." Ashton picked up the note, read it, then read it again, then read it a 3rd time, not because the sentence was long or difficult to understand, but because each time he read it, he heard another layer of meaning behind those words. She wasn't thanking him for the suit jacket. She was thanking him for turning his back for her. And she wasn't apologizing for the torn dress. She was apologizing for believing her existence in his life had been trouble. "She thinks she bothered me," Ashton said. And Jerome heard something in his voice he rarely heard. Not anger, not pity, but something closer to outrage, the kind of outrage a man feels when he sees something valuable treated like trash, and the person who owns it doesn't even know it has value. 3 days after the gala, Elise took the bus to the tailor shop the way she did every morning, Route 12, running from the Thornton neighborhood through 40 minutes of suburban roads, and she sat in the very back row with her sewing bag on her lap, looking out the window at the bare December trees passing by like the spine of something that had once been alive. And she thought that at least at the tailor shop she could be left in peace. At least there she was only Elise, the afternoon seamstress, the girl who knew how to fix zippers and replace jacket linings and hem trousers without measuring, because her eyes had grown used to estimating down to the inch. There, no one knew she was the youngest Thornton daughter. No one knew she had danced with Ashton Voss. No one knew about the black dress on the stage. But she was wrong. The owner of the tailor shop was Miss Linda, 58 years old, with short brown dyed hair and hands calloused from scissors and steam irons. And she had hired Elise 2 years earlier not out of pity, but because the first time she saw Elise repair a wedding dress with a torn hidden seam, she knew at once that this girl had the kind of hands it had taken her 30 years to have. And she didn't pay much, but she always saved Elise leftover sandwiches at the end of the day, and never asked why this 27-year-old girl had the eyes of someone who had already lived to 70. That afternoon, a customer walked in, a middle-aged woman with highlighted blonde hair, a fur coat, and a blazer that needed the sleeves altered, and when Elise stood behind the counter to write down the request, the woman looked at her longer than usual, her eyes narrowing, then widening, then her mouth opening too, and Elise felt her stomach tighten because she recognized that expression, the expression of someone who had just remembered where she had seen this face before. "I know you," the woman said, her voice loud enough for Miss Linda to hear from the back room. "You're the torn dress girl Ashton Voss stood beside. Very famous. I just read about you on the blog this morning." Elise didn't answer. She only felt the floor beneath her tilt by 1 degree, a shift no one else could see. The woman laughed, the kind of laugh that was half curious, half excited, as if she had just run into a celebrity in a coffee shop, then turned toward the back room, where Miss Linda was stepping out with a face Elise had never seen on her before, a frightened face. Miss Linda finished helping the customer, wrapped the blazer, smiled politely until the doorbell jingled as the customer had left. Then she turned to Elise, and the smile fell from her face, like a leaf dropping from a tree. "Come to the back, sweetheart," she said softly. The back room of the tailor shop was only the size of a large bathroom, with an ironing table, a fabric shelf, and the plastic chair where Elise ate lunch every day, and Miss Linda stood in the middle of the room with her arms folded across her chest, not because she was angry, but because she didn't know where to put her hands when she had to say something she didn't want to say. "Sweetheart," she began, and Elise knew every sentence that began with sweetheart ended with something painful. Being tied to the Voss name is dangerous. I don't know whether the girl in that blog is you. I'm not asking. I don't need to know. But if people start coming here looking for you, the shop will draw attention. And I don't want the shop drawing attention. You understand, don't you? I'm alone. This shop is all I have. Miss Linda didn't fire Elise. She didn't say, quit. She only told the truth. And sometimes the truth was more brutal than being fired, because it showed Elise that even the place she had thought was safe was only safe with conditions. And the condition was that she had to remain invisible, and she had been invisible for 27 years. But one single night had taken that ability away from her. Elise said, I understand, and went back to work, her hands still sewing evenly, the stitch line still straight, because her hands didn't know how to stop even when her heart was breaking. That night, she came home later than usual, stepped through the front door very quietly, and when she passed her father's study, she heard his voice through the door left slightly ajar. He was talking to someone on the phone, his voice tired and flat as stagnant pond water. Send the girl somewhere. Let the gossip cool off. I don't need any more trouble. Elise stopped outside her father's door. She stood there in the dark hallway, one hand braced against the wall, and waited. Waited for him to say more. Waited for him to say, but she's my daughter. Or, but this wasn't her fault. Or any sentence that began with, but. That little word that would mean he still had something left for her behind all the exhaustion and debt and shame. He didn't say but. He said, all right, and ended the call, and Elise heard the creak of his chair as he turned back toward his desk. And that was it. The trial had ended without the defendant, and the sentence was disappearance. That night, Elise packed in silence. Not much, because she didn't have much. The brown-covered sketchbook, the white silk ribbon her mother had once used to tie her hair when she was little, and the black dress. She folded it in thin tissue paper, as if folding a letter she hadn't finished writing. She didn't know why she was taking it with her, because it was proof of the worst night of her life. But it was also the last thing her mother had ever touched, and leaving it in this house would mean letting Gwen and Margot decide what it meant, and she had already let them decide too many things. She called Miss Linda at 11 o'clock at night. Could I stay in the back room of the shop? Just for a while? I won't cause trouble. Miss Linda was silent for 5 seconds, the longest 5 seconds of Elise's life. Then she said, bring a blanket. The back room gets cold. And Elise bit her lip so she wouldn't cry over the phone, because unexpected kindness always hurt more than cruelty you had prepared for. The next morning, Elise left the Thornton house before anyone woke, a backpack on her shoulder, her sewing bag at her side, and her mother's black dress folded in tissue paper against her back, and she walked out the door without looking back, because if she looked back, she would see the living room where her mother had once sat sewing clothes for her, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to see that and still keep walking. That afternoon, a black sedan stopped in front of the Thornton house gates, the kind of car that was neither too expensive nor too ordinary, the kind of car whose passenger didn't want attention but didn't need to hide either, and Jerome Kessler stepped out, gray coat on, salt and pepper hair combed neatly back, holding a small box wrapped in white paper, and he walked to the front door with the bearing of a man who had knocked on thousands of doors in his life and knew exactly what waited behind each one before it opened. Gwen opened the door, and in 1/10 of a second, the part she thought no one saw but Jerome saw everything, her eyes moved over the car, over Jerome's suit, over the box, and she was calculating. Elise would have seen it if she were here, but Elise wasn't here anymore. She had left early that morning with a backpack on her shoulder, and her mother's dress folded in tissue paper, and Gwen didn't know that yet, or knew and didn't care enough to notice the difference. I'd like to see Miss Elise Thornton, Jerome said, his voice polite but not warm, the kind of politeness that didn't need effort because the power standing behind him had already done the work for him. Gwen smiled, the smile she had used on every man with money since her father went bankrupt. She isn't well, she said, and her voice softened exactly where it needed to soften, worried exactly where it needed to sound worried. A perfect performance if the person watching hadn't been Jerome Kessler, a man who had spent 50 years of his life reading liars far better than Gwen. Margot appeared behind her sister, one shoulder leaning against the doorframe, her calculating gaze watching Jerome with a curiosity she didn't bother to hide. She went away to rest, Margot added, too overwhelmed after that night. The poor girl is very fragile. Jerome looked at Margot for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to make her uncomfortable, but not long enough for her to have a reason to complain. Then he nodded. I understand. He didn't argue. He didn't ask where Elise had gone, didn't ask when she would return, didn't say why he had come, because Jerome Kessler never gave the other side more information than necessary. That was a rule he had learned from Ashton's father, and kept longer than he had kept almost anything else from the dead man. He only held out the small box. Please give this to Miss Thornton. She left it behind at the gala. Gwen took the box, and Jerome turned away before she could open her mouth to ask anything more, because he had no interest in standing at this door any longer than necessary. He had smelled the lie from the very first sentence, and he wasn't the kind of man who tolerated that smell well. The door closed. Gwen carried the box into the living room, Margot following behind her, and the two of them stood beside the old coffee table where Helen had once placed fresh flowers every week, but where now there was only an old newspaper and a round coffee stain. Gwen opened the box. Inside was the thin, pale gray shawl Elise had brought to the gala, the only shawl she owned, bought for $3 at a thrift store, and it had been folded carefully, not the way a hotel employee would fold it, but the way someone had picked it up and decided it deserved to be treated kindly. Gwen lifted the shawl out and saw the note beneath it. White paper, half the size of a palm, handwritten in black ink. Not printed, not rushed, but the handwriting of someone who had time and chose to use that time to write by hand instead of sending a message, and that alone said more than the words inside. Gwen read aloud, Elise, I'm still keeping the shawl. When you're ready, come get it back. A.V. A suffocating tension hung over the living room, far heavier than that $3 shawl. Gwen read it again, and this time Elise would have seen, if she had been there, that her sister's hand tightened around the edge of the paper until her fingers went white, because this note wasn't a polite thank you from the office of Voss Holdings. It called Elise by name, not Miss Thornton but Elise. It was signed A.V., instead of Ashton Voss or Mr. Voss. It was intimate in the way Gwen had dreamed of being intimate with any powerful man for all 30 years of her life, but had never touched. And it was meant for her younger sister, the girl in the torn dress, the girl Gwen had pushed onto the stage to humiliate. And now the man Gwen had circled most heavily on her list was writing a handwritten note to that girl, using her first name. Gwen ripped the note, not slowly, not dramatically. Only one rip straight down the middle, then another until it became 4 pieces. Then she dropped them onto the table, and her face showed nothing, because Gwen had learned how to show nothing long before she learned how to smile falsely. But Gwen didn't know that before she tore it, Margot had been standing behind her, phone raised at chest level, and her finger had tapped the screen twice, once for the front of the note, once for the back of the box printed with the Peninsula Hotel logo. Margot didn't take the pictures because she cared about Elise. Margot took them because she saw a weapon, proof that Ashton Voss, the kingpin all of Chicago, both feared and wanted near, was writing by hand to the youngest Thornton daughter, and in the world Margot lived in, information was currency, and this photograph was savings she would cash out when the time was right. Not today, not this week, but someday. And Margot was more patient than Gwen in that way. She didn't destroy valuable things. She put them away. Jerome sat in the car outside the gate and called Ashton. She's left the house, he said. The 2 sisters lied. The first said she wasn't well. The second said she went away to rest. They didn't settle on a story beforehand, which means they didn't care enough to prepare. Silence came from the other end of the line. The kind of silence Jerome knew well, the kind Ashton fell into when he was moving from observation to decision. Find her, Ashton said. And in those 2 words, Jerome heard something he hadn't heard in a very long time in the voice of the orphaned boy he had raised. Not the command of a boss, but the request of a man worried for someone other than himself. 10 days after the gala. 7 days since Elise left the Thornton house with a backpack on her shoulders and her mother's dress folded in tissue paper. It took Jerome 3 days to find her, not because he wasn't good, but because Elise hadn't left any meaningful trail behind. She didn't use a credit card because she didn't have one. She didn't post anything on social media because she didn't have social media. She was only a girl who took bus number 12 to a tailor shop in the suburbs and slept in the back room on a folding mattress Mrs. Linda had pulled out of storage. And to find someone like that, even Jerome Kessler had to spend 3 days asking around, checking, and finally relying on an acquaintance in the taxi business who remembered driving a young woman with dark brown hair and a backpack to that neighborhood early in the morning. That evening, Elise was working the late shift alone. Mrs. Linda had gone home at 6 o'clock. The shop was empty because in suburban Chicago in December, everyone was home after 7 o'clock except the people who had no home to return to. Elise was sitting behind the counter, hemming a pair of jeans for a customer who was supposed to pick them up the next morning. When the bell over the door rang, she looked up and saw a man walk in. Tall, black coat, black hair. And he looked out of place in that tiny tailor shop in the same way a Patek Philippe watch would look out of place in a $2 watch store. Everything on him cost more than the total value of everything in the shop combined. But he didn't look uncomfortable. He only stood there, holding a suit jacket in his hands, and offered it forward. "Can you fix this?" he asked, his voice calm, as though he walked into tailor shops every day, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Elise looked at the jacket. Midnight blue, wool blended with cashmere, hand-stitched seams, and she recognized it immediately because her hands had touched that jacket 10 days earlier in the fluorescent hallway behind the emergency exit at the Peninsula Hotel. She had worn it when she stepped onto the dance floor. She had folded it carefully, crease by crease, before returning it with her handwritten note. And now it was here, lying on the counter of a tailor shop, with a tear at the shoulder that she was 100% certain hadn't been there when she folded it. She looked up. Ashton Voss stood in front of her, his dark brown eyes fixed on hers without blinking, and in this tiny tailor shop, he didn't look like a crime lord, didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a man trying to find a way to say something that power and money couldn't say for him. "You brought the jacket here for me to fix," Elise said, and it wasn't a question. "It's torn," Ashton said. It wasn't torn. Neither of them breathed a word. Then one corner of his mouth lifted, not in a victorious smile, but in a surrendered one, the kind of smile worn by a man who knows he's just been caught and doesn't bother denying it. "Then I needed a reason to come here." Elise didn't smile back. She set the jacket down on the counter, kept both hands still on the glass, and looked at him with the gray-blue eyes Ashton remembered from the night of the gala. But now they were different. They no longer trembled with hope or shame. They were calm and tired in the way only the eyes of someone who had hit bottom could be. Someone who had discovered that the bottom hadn't killed her, but it hadn't given her any reason to trust anyone either. "How did you find me?" she asked. Ashton didn't dodge. That was something she would learn about him later, that he could be cold, dangerous, silent enough to make an entire room feel breathless. But he never dodged when he was asked a direct question. "Jerome found you. You had someone follow me." This time, it wasn't a question either. Ashton looked at her, and his eyes didn't turn away. "I had someone make sure you were safe. That's different." And that was when Elise got angry. Not the loud kind of anger, not the kind that slammed fists on tables or rose into shouting. It was quiet anger. The anger of someone who had stayed silent for too long, and now every word she spoke weighed twice as much, because it carried the burden of all the time she hadn't spoken. "That isn't protection," she said, her voice low and even, not trembling. "That's control. And I've had enough people controlling my life." That sentence struck Ashton in a way he hadn't prepared for, because he had prepared himself for gratitude, for awkwardness, for questions, even for fear, but he hadn't prepared himself for the truth. And the truth was that she was right. He had sent someone to find her without asking whether she wanted to be found. He had decided for her that she needed to be protected without asking whether she wanted protection. And that was exactly what her family had done for 27 years, making decisions for her. The only difference was that they had decided she should suffer, while he had decided she should be safe. But at the root, it was the same thing. It was still taking away her right to choose. Ashton stopped. For the first time in a very long time, perhaps for the first time Jerome would have ever seen if he had been there, Ashton Voss had no answer. He stood inside that tiny tailor shop with the torn jacket on the counter, and the seamstress looking at him with eyes that didn't beg and didn't ask to be rescued. And he couldn't find a single word to say because every word he thought of sounded like an excuse. And she didn't need an excuse. She needed the truth. "You're right," he said. 2 words. No explanation. No added but. No added, "I only wanted to." Just, "You're right." And he said those 2 words in the voice of a man who had truly heard what she'd just said, not one who was simply waiting for her to finish so he could answer. Elise looked at him for 3 more seconds, long enough to make sure he didn't intend to add anything, didn't intend to turn the situation around with words or charm or power. Then she said, her voice not cold but clear, as a line drawn along a tailor's ruler, "Please leave my shop." Ashton picked up the jacket. He didn't justify himself, didn't linger, didn't look back. He walked to the door, the bell ringing as it closed behind him, and Elise stood alone in the tailor shop with the sound of the bell still trembling in the air, and her hands began to shake, not from fear, but because she had just thrown the most powerful man in Chicago out of her shop, and he had left. He had really left. And she didn't know whether that made her feel lighter or hurt more, because this was the first time in her life that someone had heard her say go, and actually gone, without staying to argue, without staying to prove he was right, without staying to make her feel guilty for daring to speak. He simply left, and his leaving respected her more than any bouquet of flowers or apology ever could. That night, Elise couldn't sleep. She lay on the folding mattress in the back room of the tailor shop. The blanket pulled up to her chin because Mrs. Linda had been right. The back room was terribly cold, and she stared up at the ceiling where a water stain looked like the map of some country whose name she couldn't remember. She thought about Ashton Voss walking out of the tailor shop without looking back, about the bell trembling when the door closed, about the 2 words, "You're right," that he had spoken as if setting down something heavy. And she thought that she had sent away the only person in the last 10 days who had come looking for her not to take something from her, but to give her something. But she had also been right to send him away, because kindness didn't give anyone the right to make decisions for someone else. Both things were true at the same time, and that was exactly why she couldn't sleep, because the world would be so much easier to bear if things were only right or wrong, instead of being right and painful all at once. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, she sat up, pulled the small desk lamp closer, and took the sketchbook from her backpack. She opened to the last page, the page with the black bateau neck dress she had drawn over and over again. The dress meant for a woman who could walk into a room without asking anyone's permission, and she placed her pencil on the new page beside it. And nothing happened. Her hand rested the pencil tip on the paper, and it stayed there, motionless, as if the pencil had forgotten how to write, or as if her hand had lost its connection to the part of the brain that knew how to dream. She tried to draw a straight line, just one straight line, any line at all, but her fingers wouldn't move, not because they were paralyzed, but because they didn't know what to draw, didn't know whom to draw for. Every design she had ever sketched had been a promise to herself that one day she would sew it into reality, and now that promise sounded like an echo in an empty room, growing more hollow each time it repeated itself. She looked toward the corner of the room where her mother's black dress lay folded in tissue paper, and for the first time, she thought maybe Gwen was right. Maybe she didn't belong anywhere. Not in the ballroom, not in the world of fashion design, not in any room where people could look at her and see something worth keeping. Maybe she was only someone who sewed, someone who repaired clothes for other people, and then returned to sit in the back room of a tailor shop, staring up at the stain on the ceiling and calling that a life. She closed the sketchbook. Not gently, the way she usually did, but quickly, like shutting a door she didn't want to look through anymore. Then she shoved it into the bottom of her backpack, beneath her mother's white ribbon, beneath the spool of nylon thread and the spare needles, burying it under practical things because dreams weren't practical. Dreams didn't pay rent. Dreams didn't keep the back room of a tailor shop warm at 2 o'clock in the morning in December in Chicago. And she turned off the lamp, lay down, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 8 years since her mother died, Elise Thornton went to sleep without drawing anything. The next morning, she woke at 6 o'clock, opened the shop at 7, and worked as she did every day, because life didn't stop just because someone had lost hope. It simply kept going and forced people to keep going with it. The first customer brought in a coat torn at the shoulder, a clean tear, probably caught on a door hook, and Elise sat down, took out a needle, chose the right color thread, and her hands began to sew. She didn't think, didn't plan the line of stitches, didn't calculate. Her hands knew on their own where to go. Her fingers knew when to pull the thread tight and when to loosen it, and when she finished sewing, she sat there looking at the seam she had just made. Beautiful, precise, perfect. Every stitch, even as a row of trees planted by someone who loved trees. And she realized that her hands still knew how to save things. They still knew how to take something torn and make it whole again, even when her mind had given up. Even when she had buried the sketchbook at the bottom of her backpack and called it surrender, her hands still refused to surrender. They still sewed, still mended, still held things together, as if they knew something she didn't yet know, that a person who knew how to save things for others would one day learn how to save herself. She was still sitting there, looking at that seam, when she heard a soft sound at the door. Not the bell, because the door hadn't opened, but the rustle of paper sliding across the floor. She looked down and saw an envelope lying on the tile just beneath the crack of the door. A white envelope, with no sender's name, only her own name written on the outside in the shaky, slightly slanted handwriting of someone very old. Elise opened the envelope with fingers still clinging to bits of thread from the seam she had just finished. Inside was a small piece of paper, yellowed with age, the kind of paper people only still found in tailor shops that had existed before Elise was born. The words were written in blue ink, not typed, not printed, but handwritten by someone who had spent a lifetime writing by hand, because she came from an age when handwriting was the only way to say something important. Mr. Voss said I should meet you. I don't take orders from him, but I'm curious. Antonia Ferretti. Workshop address on the back. Elise turned the envelope over. On the back was an address written in the same shaky handwriting. A street on the west side of Chicago that Elise had never heard of. She read the line again. I don't take orders from him, but I'm curious. And she understood at once that the person who had written it wasn't the kind of woman who did whatever someone told her to do. She had come here because she wanted to, not because Ashton Voss had ordered her. And there was something in that small stubbornness that made Elise smile. Her first smile in many days. Not wide, not bright, just the corner of her mouth lifting because an old woman she had never met had slid an envelope under the tailor shop door on the very morning her hands had reminded her that they hadn't forgotten how to save things. And maybe, just maybe, that was a sign that she hadn't forgotten how to save herself either. Antonia Ferretti's sewing workshop sat on the ground floor of an old red brick building on a street Google Maps called a road, though in truth it was only an alley wide enough for one car to pass through. And when Elise stood before the peeling blue-painted wooden door the next morning, her mother's black dress folded in tissue paper and held against her chest, she almost turned back because she didn't know what she was doing there, didn't know who this 78-year-old woman who wrote letters in blue ink was, didn't know why Ashton Voss had told her about Elise. But then the door opened before she had time to knock, as if the person inside had been waiting and had heard the sound of her hesitation through the wood. Antonia Ferretti was smaller than Elise had imagined, not quite 5'1", her white silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck with an old tortoiseshell clip, her eyes dark brown but bright in the way of someone who had seen too much in life and still chose to keep looking instead of closing her eyes. And her hands, the hands Elise looked at first because she always looked at other people's hands before their faces, were calloused at the index fingers and thumbs, the kind of calluses only people had when they had held a needle more than they had held anything else in their lives. And Elise recognized those hands as being like her mother's, so much like them that she had to swallow to keep her voice from shaking when she said, "Hello, I'm Elise." Antonia didn't greet her back. She didn't ask how Elise was, didn't invite her to sit, didn't ask whether she wanted something to drink. She only looked down at the bundle of tissue paper in Elise's arms and said, "Give me the dress," in the voice of a woman who didn't waste time on pleasantries because she was 78 years old now, and every minute she had left was worth more than any greeting. Elise handed her the dress. Antonia opened the tissue paper on the large wooden table in the middle of the workshop, her hands smoothing the fabric flat with slow, precise movements, and she examined it in silence for a long time, her fingers following every seam, every fray, every place where the fabric had thinned, while Elise stood beside her and watched this woman touch her mother's dress with a kind of respect she hadn't seen anyone give it since her mother died. Then Antonia's fingers stopped at the left hip, where the stitching had been cut and then sewn back together with thin thread, and she looked up. "Who cut this seam?" "My sister," Elise said, and she was surprised by how easily the sentence left her mouth. Perhaps because telling the truth to a stranger was easier than telling the truth to family. Antonia nodded, her face unchanged, not shocked, not pitying, just nodding as if the answer confirmed what she had already known. "I've seen this kind of cut before," she said. "Not on fabric, on people." The sentence fell into the quiet workshop and stayed there, heavy, and Elise didn't ask what she meant because she understood. Antonia was saying that cruelty had the same shape no matter what material it was done to, and she had lived long enough to recognize it with only a touch. Elise waited for her to say, "I'll fix it for you." But Antonia didn't say that. She looked at Elise, looked straight into her eyes, and said, "This dress was your mother's. You have to save it yourself." Then she turned away, opened the desk drawer, and took out a small wooden box filled with embroidery thread in every color, curved embroidery needles, tiny scissors, and a spool of silver thread that felt cool and smooth like water running through Elise's fingers when she touched it. And Antonia began to teach. 3 mornings. Every morning, Elise came to the workshop at 7 o'clock, studied until 11 o'clock, then took the bus back to the tailor shop to work the afternoon and evening shift because she still needed to pay Mrs. Linda, even though Mrs. Linda wouldn't take the money, but Elise still left it on the counter every week because she didn't want to live on one more person's pity. On the first morning, Antonia taught her restoration embroidery, how to turn a tear into a line of stitching so that the person looking wouldn't see damage but a work of art, how to choose a pattern for each kind of harm. And when Elise asked what she should embroider, Antonia pointed out the window at a wildflower growing out of a crack in the concrete sidewalk in front of the workshop. "Wildflowers," she said. "They grow in places where no one invited them. That's why they're beautiful." On the second morning, Elise began to embroider, silver thread on black fabric, each small wildflower blooming in the exact place where the zipper had once split, in the exact place where the seam had been cut, in the exact places where her 2 sisters' cruelty had left its marks. And every stitch was an answer to every time she had been told she wasn't good enough. Every silver flower was a word she had never spoken out loud, but her hands were speaking for her. "I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still here." On the third morning, Antonia sat watching Elise embroider without correcting anything, because there was nothing to correct. Elise's hands moved across the fabric with an instinct that no longer needed guidance, and Antonia said, her voice light but not soft, "You have the hands of a true seamstress. Why haven't you sewn for yourself yet?" Elise didn't answer, because the question was too close to the sketchbook, buried at the bottom of her backpack, too close to the bateau neck dress on the last page that she had drawn again and again, and then closed away on the night she thought she didn't belong anywhere. But her fingers kept embroidering, and perhaps that was the answer. When the final stitch was finished, Elise lifted the dress into the morning light pouring through the workshop window, and she looked at it, her mother's black dress, the dress her sister had ruined to humiliate her, the dress that had torn on stage in front of more than 100 people, now blooming with flowers, silver wildflowers running down the back, spreading along the hip, opening in the exact places that had once been wounds. And it was beautiful, not because it looked new, but because someone had been patient enough to save it, and that someone was her own hands. The hands Gwen had said no one would marry, the hands Margot had said only knew how to serve other people, the hands her mother had once said knew how to listen. Those very hands had saved the dress no one else cared enough to save. Elise cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears slipping down her cheeks in silence because she was holding in her hands proof that she could save something that had been damaged. And if she could save the dress, then maybe, just maybe, she could save more than that. Antonia didn't comfort her. She only poured a small cup of espresso, set it beside Elise's elbow, and returned to her work drawer, because she was the kind of woman who showed love with coffee and well-timed silence, and sometimes that was enough. Ashton Voss wasn't in the workshop that morning. He didn't see Elise cry. He didn't see the dress bloom. He had only placed the right person in the right place, the way a crime lord operated, not doing the work with his own hands, but creating the conditions for the right thing to happen, and then stepping aside. And perhaps that was the kindest thing Ashton Voss had ever done, not the act itself but the absence, because sometimes respecting someone means letting them save themselves without turning yourself into the hero of their story. 2 weeks before the event, Patty, the young woman Elise had comforted on the balcony during the first gala, called at 9 o'clock at night while Elise was sitting in the back room of the tailor shop, hemming a dress for a customer, and Patty's voice over the phone still carried the same energy Elise remembered from the night of the gala. The kind of energy young people had before life taught them how to lower their voices. Voss Holdings is holding a second charity event, Patty said, 3 months after that night. Same Peninsula Hotel. I've been called back to serve. The line went quiet for a beat. Then Patty added, her voice a little lower, more careful, as though she was choosing each word instead of letting them rush out the way she usually did. You should come. Not because of Mr. Voss. Because of yourself. Elise didn't answer right away. She sat on the plastic chair in the back room of the tailor shop, the phone tucked between her shoulder and her ear, her hand still holding the needle, and her eyes drifted toward the corner of the room, where the restored black dress hung on the wooden hanger Antonia had given her to take home. The silver wildflowers shimmered softly beneath the fluorescent light, and she thought about the last time she had stood inside the Peninsula Hotel. The zipper splitting open on stage, the laughter behind the fans, her hand reaching behind her back and closing on nothing. And she wondered what she would be returning, as if she went back. She was no longer Miss Thornton because she had left that house. She wasn't a guest, because no one had invited her. She was only a seamstress who slept in the back room of a tailor shop in the suburbs. But maybe that was exactly the way she should return. Not as anyone else, only as herself. "Let me think about it," Elise said to Patty. But she had already finished thinking. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud. She hung up, set the phone down, and looked at the dress for a long while longer. Looked at the silver wildflowers her own hands had embroidered into the exact places that had once been ruined, and she remembered Antonia asking, "Why haven't you sewn for yourself yet?" She remembered the sketchbook still buried at the bottom of her backpack. She remembered her hands that morning sewing the coat torn at the shoulder with a perfect seam even after her mind had already given up, and she made her decision. No one told her to go. No one dragged her there. She chose for herself. The next morning, she called Antonia, not to ask for advice, but to ask for work. "Do you have any orders that need to be delivered to the Voss event?" And Antonia, who had been sewing uniforms for staff at major Chicago events for 30 years, though her hands had grown weaker now and her eyes dimmer than before, even if she would never admit it, said, "Yes, 3 sets, but you'll have to sew them under my name because the contract is in my name." And Elise said, "All right." And that was it. She had a proper reason to step into the Peninsula Hotel for the second time, not through the front entrance in ruby red and champagne gold, but through the back door, the door for staff, the door for the people who made the night run, but were never invited to sit at the tables. And Elise found that it suited her better than any invitation ever could. She sewed the 3 uniforms over the following week, the stitching so beautiful that Antonia looked at them and nodded without saying a word, and that woman's silence was the highest praise she ever gave anyone. On the day of the event, Elise folded the 3 uniforms into a bag, and at the bottom of that bag, wrapped in tissue paper, she placed her mother's black dress. She didn't know whether she would wear it. She didn't plan it. She only brought it with her because her hands had saved it. And she didn't want to leave it alone in the back room of the tailor shop anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she brought it because some part of her knew that this dress hadn't finished telling its story yet. Ashton stood alone on the second-floor balcony of the Peninsula, a glass of liquor resting untouched on the railing, and this was an old habit. At every event he hosted, he always found a way to disappear from his own event for at least 15 minutes, because Ashton Voss could endure almost anything in the world, but he couldn't endure a crowd of people laughing falsely for too long. That laughter clung to his skin the way cigarette smoke clung to curtains, and he needed the cold Chicago air of March to wash it away. The glass door behind him opened, and Jerome stepped out, hands in his pockets, his face calm as always. But there was something in the way he paused before speaking that showed he was choosing his words, and Jerome rarely chose his words because he usually knew exactly what he wanted to say. "Miss Thornton is here," he said. A short silence. "She's wearing that dress." Ashton didn't turn around. He didn't ask which dress because he knew there was only one dress Jerome would mention in that voice. He stood there a little longer, looking down at the street where car lights moved in streams of brightness beneath the building, and he thought about the last time he had seen her, in that tiny tailor shop, her gray-blue eyes looking at him without trembling and without fear as she said, "That's control." And she had been right. And he had left. And he hadn't gone back, hadn't sent a letter, hadn't called, hadn't asked Jerome to watch her, hadn't done anything except tell Antonia about her before Elise sent him away, and then let everything unfold on its own. And now she was here, in that dress. And he didn't know whether she had come because of him, or because of herself, or because of both, or because of no one at all. And for the first time in a very long time, Ashton Voss didn't know what the next step was. And that was both uncomfortable and strangely relieving, because at least it meant he was standing in territory that money and power couldn't draw a map for. Jerome stood waiting. Ashton said nothing. Jerome understood, nodded, and turned back inside, closing the glass door gently behind him, because he knew there were moments when even the person closest to you needed to know when to leave. 5 minutes later, the glass door opened again, but it wasn't Jerome. Elise stepped out onto the balcony, and she stopped when she saw him. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and they looked at each other in the weak light spilling from the ballroom through the glass door, and neither of them spoke for a few seconds, because both of them were realizing the same thing, that they had met here not because one had gone looking for the other, but because both of them had chosen the quietest place. Both of them had needed to leave that room in order to breathe, and perhaps that said more than any invitation could have. "I didn't know you would come," Ashton said, and Elise heard the truth in that sentence because his voice held no preparation, no performance, only surprise he didn't hide. "I didn't know either," Elise said, "not until about 20 minutes ago." Ashton looked down at the dress, and he saw the silver wildflowers shimmering softly along the back, blooming at the hip, trailing down toward the hem, and he said, "Wildflowers," in a low voice, not as a question but as confirmation, as though he were reading something written into the fabric that only he understood. "Antonia calls them survivors," Elise said. "They grow from cracks. You embroidered them?" "Every stitch." A quiet hush settled between them. Then Ashton spoke, and his voice changed, softer, closer, as though he had just removed something he had been carrying all night, more beautiful than anything I could ever buy. Elise looked at him, and she asked the question she had been holding since the night he walked out of the tailor shop. "Why didn't you give up when I sent you away?" Ashton set his glass down on the railing, and he didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the city below, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Not the voice of a crime lord, not the voice of a CEO, but the voice of a child telling a story he had kept inside for too long. "I lost both my parents before I was old enough to drive," he said. "At my father's funeral, I wore his suit. It was huge on me, torn at the shoulder because it didn't fit. I stood in front of the coffin in that torn suit, and I heard someone behind me say, 'The Voss family is finished.'" He stopped. I remember that sentence more clearly than all the condolences put together. The Chicago wind moved across the balcony, cold, and Elise stood still because she knew that this was not a moment that needed words. This was a moment that only needed someone to stand there and listen, because sometimes the silence of the listener was the most precious thing a person telling the story could receive. "When I saw you standing in that dress at the gala," Ashton said, and he turned back to look at her, "I didn't see a strange woman. I saw myself. 14 years old, a torn suit, and the whole room laughing." Elise felt her eyes grow hot, but she didn't cry because she had cried enough, and tonight wasn't the night for crying. Tonight was the night to stand straight. Music from the ballroom drifted out through the glass door, soft and distant, like a sound arriving from another world, and Ashton held out his hand, not dramatically, not beautifully staged, only an open hand offered in front of her, and he said, "There's no one out here. No scandal, no camera, no blog. Just me asking whether you want to dance." Elise looked at his hand, and she remembered the last time, in the fluorescent hallway, his jacket loose across her shoulders, the laughter still echoing in her ears, and she asked, "Last time you asked to save me. Why are you asking this time?" "Because I want to dance with you," Ashton said, and those simple words were so simple they had to be true, because no one invented an answer that simple. Elise placed her hand in his, and they danced on the second-floor balcony of the Peninsula Hotel, with no orchestra, only the music slipping through the glass door and the wind and the sound of the city below, and no one saw them, no one knew, and that was exactly what made this moment feel more real than any dance on the crystal floor inside. Inside the ballroom, Gwen was dancing with a businessman who owned 3 penthouses, her smile wide, her blonde hair glittering, and she was radiant as always. Radiant in the exact way she had practiced her whole life. Margot stood beside a politician, laughing at the right moment, saying the right thing, and the phone in her purse had been locked away, its secrets buried forever. No one in the ballroom mentioned Elise, but Gwen and Margot's punishment wasn't being forgotten. Their punishment was that they had gotten everything they had ever wanted: attention, rich men, lights, laughter in the right places, smiles from the right people, and still it wasn't enough. Still, it didn't make them warm. Still, they kept looking around the room for something they couldn't name, but knew they were missing. And Elise, on the dark balcony, in her mother's dress blooming with silver wildflowers, was dancing with the man who had seen her before he saw anyone else. And she wasn't searching for anything at all, because she had something Gwen and Margot would never understand, even if they read every guest list in the world. It wasn't money, wasn't power, wasn't admiration. It was simply being chosen for herself, not for her family name, not for the dress, not for anything except the person she was. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. Perhaps the greatest lesson Elise leaves us with isn't how she was saved, but how she saved herself. Because something damaged doesn't mean something worthless. Sometimes it's only waiting for hands patient enough to see the beauty still left inside. Each of us carries tears that other people have left behind, but the way we choose to live with those torn places is what defines who we are. Not the dress, but the one who wears it. Not the wound, but the flower that grows from the crack. If this story touched you, please hit like to support us so we can keep telling stories that reach the heart every day. Share this video with someone you love, someone who may need to hear that they deserve to be seen for exactly who they are. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe now so you don't miss the next stories we pour so much heart into bringing to you. How did this story make you feel? Write it in the comments below so we can listen to the feelings from deep within your heart, because every line you leave is motivation for us to keep going each day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for being here, goodbye, and see you again in the next video.